Hi, Mr. Wright here, and welcome to this film in which I'll take you through my predictions for the Edexcel IGCSE Maths exams in summer 2025. Clearly, if you're preparing for those exams, this film and its accompanying film, which I'll tell you more about in a minute, are vital watching. But this film is also going to be really useful to those of you who are preparing for your mock exams in January, February, March, before taking your real exams in May and June of 2025. So, how does this predictions film work and how can you get the most out of it? Well, in a moment or two, I'll take you through my predicted topics for the Edexcel IGCSE Maths in summer 2025. Now, because these predictions are based upon the frequency that each topic has come up on past papers, this film is obviously vital watching if you're preparing for your exams in May and June, but it's also vital watching if you're preparing for your mocks, because these predictions will be just as useful for your mock exams as they will be for the real thing. Now, what to do after you've watched the predictions film? Well, each of my predicted topics comes with two example questions. One example question from the easier end of the paper, and one example question from the harder end, a grade 7, 8, or 9 question. What you can do is you can download a document containing all of these example questions, tackle those questions, and then review your solutions against my solutions film. If you were to do this, you will have worked through example questions for all of those topics which I'm predicting will come up in your papers. So that could be a really good core part of your revision, be it revision for mocks or revision for your real exams in summer 2025. Right, so what do the predictions for each of my topics look like? Well, here's an example. This is my information on simultaneous equations. Now, of course, each topic I'm predicting, I tell you what that topic is. What a surprise. This is simultaneous equations. And each topic has a percentage assigned to it. Now, 75% for simultaneous equations. This means that simultaneous equations appears on 75% of every past paper. So, if you're preparing for your mocks or for your real exams, you know that simultaneous equations is more than likely to appear on paper 1. And indeed, given that it's got a percentage of more than 50%, it could well appear on both of the papers which you're preparing for. So if something has a percentage of over 100%, then I am predicting that it's certain to appear on both of your papers. If it has a percentage of 75% plus, then I'm calling it pretty certain. After all, on average, it appears more than once across your two papers. And if it has a percentage of over 63%, then I'm calling it extremely likely. It appears on 63% of every past paper. So, what's more, this film only deals with topics which have a percentage of over 63%. So every topic covered on this film is extremely likely to appear at least once across the two papers which you're preparing for. Now, each of my topics has an example question, and the joy of these example questions is, yes, I can talk you through them very briefly through this film, but you can download all of these example questions, tackle the questions, and then compare your solutions with my solutions film. And as I've already said, I think that this will be really useful to those of you preparing for mocks or for your real exams, because by working your way through all the example questions, you are covering all of those topics which I'm predicting will show up, or at least all those topics which have shown up on 63% or more of every Edexcel past paper. Right, let's get on with the predictions. So let's kick off with percentages. Percentages appears more than once on average on every past paper. So I reckon it's going to appear on both of the papers which you will be taking. Now, percentages questions vary. Here's an example where one has to work out the percentage profit. Equally, you might have to work out the price of an item after a percentage change, or indeed the value of an investment after a percentage change, or you might have to work out the value of something before a percentage change, so-called reverse percentages. Right, the next topic that I'm predicting is bounds. Now, bounds I think is extremely likely to come up. It comes up on average more than once on every pair of papers. Right, here's an example of a relatively straightforward question on bounds. You need to work out the upper bound for the perimeter and the area of a rectangle. You need to take those dimensions, work out the upper and lower bound of each, and use those in subsequent calculations. Here's an example of a more difficult question. Much more algebra involved here. We're using values correct to a number of significant figures or decimal places, and we're putting either the upper or the lower bound of each of those variables into the equation. In this case, to work out the value of f to a suitable degree of accuracy, sometimes to work out the maximum possible value of f or the minimum possible value of f. Remember, each of these questions are in the example questions document, which you can download. Coordinate geometry. Coordinate geometry comes up on average once on every paper. So I'm calling this certain. Here's an example of a relatively straightforward coordinate geometry question, finding the equation of a line perpendicular to that one. Remember, to find the equation of a line, you need to know the gradient of the line and a point on the line. If you're unsure, there's lots on the YouTube channel to help you. And here's an example of a more difficult question, a more difficult coordinate geometry question. In this question, you need to be fluent with perpendicular lines, perpendicular gradients, and indeed with coordinate geometry as a whole. Next, circles. These are questions that involve using your two circular formulas, the formula for the circumference of a circle and the formula for the area of a circle, often in quite involved problems. Here's a relatively straightforward question where you need to find the perimeter of that shape, and here's a more difficult question where you need to find the perimeter of that square, given some information about the circles within it. If you're going for a top grade, you need to be fluent on these more difficult questions. Next, polygons. Polygons is pretty certain to come up. It comes up on average more than once in every pair of papers. It has a percentage of more than 50%. So I'm expecting it to come up at least once across your two papers. Here's a relatively easy polygon question, and here's a more complex polygon question. Often you need to find exterior angles or interior angles or the sum of the interior angles, and that helps you solve the problem at hand. Next, probability. Probability is absolutely certain to come up. Historically, it comes up more than once on every paper. It's a must-revise topic. Sometimes the questions are relatively straightforward and probabilities are set out in a table like this. Sometimes the probability questions involve a tree diagram, and sometimes, if you're going for a top grade, you will want to be absolutely fluent and well prepared for probability questions that involve you using some quite complex algebra, like this one. Simultaneous equations. Simultaneous equations come up at least once across the two papers. Generally, they come up twice in my experience, although the percentage is 75%. So they come up at least once, if not twice, across the two papers. Often there's a linear simultaneous equations question, like this one. Personally, I'd make the coefficients on the x's equal and then subtract. And often there's a question which involves solving simultaneous equations when one of them is quadratic. If you're going for a top grade, make sure you're fluent on these. Linear equations, an 81% chance they are pretty certain to come up on the next paper that you sit. Indeed, I reckon they'll be across the two papers. Here's an example of a linear equation, one which involves you dealing with that fraction on the left and leaves you and then with an equation with unknowns on both sides. And here's a more complex example of a linear equation. In that case, I think I would probably multiply both sides by 20, or perhaps I'd combine those two fractions on the left. Functions. Functions is extremely likely to come up. It comes up more than 50% of the time, so it's going to come up at least once across the 2 papers that you sit. Sometimes you simply have to substitute a value in for x. In this case, you need to find the f of 10, so you'll substitute 10 into that expression. Finding inverse functions, part B there, can be pretty complex, can involve completing the square and other algebraic techniques. And here's a harder example of a functions question. Again, most functions questions start with substituting in a value for x. But here is an example of finding the inverse function. And in that case, we're going to be completing the square, but taking out a 2 first to give us a unitary coefficient on our x squared. If you're going for a top grade, make sure you're fluent in these algebraic techniques. Trigonometry. At the easier end, we are looking at using SOHCAHTOA in right-angled triangles in 2 dimensions, perhaps to find a side, perhaps to find an angle. Here's another example of a trigonometry question in 2 dimensions where there's some context where the trigonometry is slightly more hidden in the context of the question. And here's an example of using trigonometry in 3 dimensions. Trigonometry, I've given that a rating of pretty certain. It's going to come up. It comes up on 94% of every past paper. So it's going to come up at least once, if not twice, across the 2 papers that you're sitting. Mean, median, mode and range, and interquartile range. Well, this comes up 75% of the time, so you need to know what you're doing. Sometimes you're asked to draw a cumulative frequency graph given the information in the question, and sometimes you're asked to analyze a table of information. Here we've got grouped data, look, and we're being asked to find the modal class and then the mean frame size. So sometimes, speaking off the top of my head, there'll be questions where you have to solve problems involving mean, median, mode, and range as well. Right, next, indices. 138%. Look at that. It comes up at least once on every paper, and I would expect it to come up at least twice across your 2 papers. Some of the indice rules are quite straightforward. You can learn them by rote. Sometimes questions involving indices involve you to use some more complex algebra. And if you're going for a top grade, you need to be fluent in questions like this. Download my document with all of these example questions on, work your way through it, and then use my solutions film. Sequences, extremely likely to come up. A rating of more than 50%, it comes up more than once across your 2 papers. Perhaps a relatively straightforward question would involve finding the formula for the nth term of a linear sequence, and a more complex question might involve working out solutions to problems involving the sum of a sequence and that sort of thing. Again, if you're going for a top grade, you need to be fluent with the questions at the top end. You don't want there to be any surprises if you're going for a top grade. Quadratics. Here's a simple example, expanding this pair of brackets. Here's a slightly harder example, expanding 3 brackets. Everyone can work hard and can crack how to solve these questions. It's just a question of practice and know-how. Get in touch if you want a hand. Here's an example of solving a quadratic equation. Again, these questions come up so often that you really need to be fluent in solving them. And here's an example of solving a quadratic equation with a coefficient on the x squared. Perhaps you'll want to use the formula for this, or perhaps you can factorize it, but it's going to be a more complex factorization. Venn diagrams. Extremely likely to come up, a rating of 63%. They come up in 2 different guises, really. Sometimes you're given a Venn diagram and you're asked to find information from it, and on other occasions you're asked to draw your own or fill in your own Venn diagram given some information. Venn diagram questions can be quite complex, can appear towards the end of the paper, and could make the difference between you getting a grade 7, 8 or 9. Histograms, extremely likely to come up. Sometimes you're given data and you're asked to draw a histogram. On other occasions, you're given a histogram and you're asked to interpret that. Histograms, make sure you're fluent. It's a method. You can crack it. Let me know if you want a hand. Cones, pyramids, and spheres, pretty certain to come up. Here's an example of a question at the easier end, still not easy, where you're given the surface area of a sphere and asked to find the volume of the sphere from that. I'm guessing that you're going to use that surface area to find the radius and then use the radius to find the volume. And here's an example of a harder question here involving a frustum. Again, if you're going for a top grade, you need to be fluent in these questions. So there you have it. That was quite a high-speed canter through all of those topics which have got a prediction rating of more than 63%. They come up on 63% or more of every past paper. What's your next steps? Well, as I've said, download the example questions. The link is in the description of the film. Give them a go and watch my solutions video for those. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you think of my predictions. What topics do you think are likely to come up that haven't been included in this film? If you want a hand, leave me a question and of course I will respond. Thanks for watching. See you in the next film.